Hello, good evening, and welcome to the sixth session of My Life in the Legion of Christ. Um, and I've and Sentimental Dubliner in the Legion of Christ. Just occurred to me that this is um, the real story and a real testimony of life in the Legion of Christ. In contrast to the official stories, those rewritten histories that the Legion, together with other oppressive institutions, um, come out with from time to time. This is the truth. Anyway, we're still in chapter 5. See if we can finish it today in this sixth session, taping session. I was remarking to a couple of friends of mine today, how these sessions are very therapeutic for me. I hope they are for you too, for anybody who is involved with the Legion of Christ. Uh, I think I'm over the whole experience to a large extent, and therefore I'm in a recovery period. I'm in a healing uh, state of mind, and hopefully this can help other people who may have been through similar circumstances. Mine was particularly long. 23 years is a long time to be in the Legion of Christ and still have and still be healthy mentally. Uh, I believe some of the recent exiting, and I say recent, I mean 10 years ago, recent exiting Americans, prominent Americans, and very well transitioned into the diocesan priesthood. One would be Stephen Fichter, and the other one is Thomas. Think of the name now. Excuse me. These are very well transitioned, and one of them mentioned that he had been in the Legion for 23 years. So I'm not the only one. Um, Let me just continue here. So talking about the Holy Novitiate and starting my spiritual direction and so forth with Father Arami. This was every evening we had the explanation of rules, explicación de reglas. For a good legionary, the lightest issues were serious, and all rules and norms, no matter how small, trivial, should be followed with the same exacting fidelity as expressions of God's will. Key to the Legion spirit and mystique, explained Father Arame, was that a member should bare his soul to his spiritual director with absolute trust, but he should not disclose his personal feelings or problems to anyone else. I think this might have prompted my good friend Jose Barba Martin, one of the great Maciel survivors, and the man who brought the story of the survivors to the American public in 1997 in an article in the Hartford Courant, and that was the work of Gerald Renner and Jason Berry. That was the first time these stories of these obscure Mexicans, obscure to the English-speaking world, made their appearance in the American press, and that was a really breakthrough moment. And at that time, the Berlin Wall was starting to crumble to some degree, even though they've tried to put Humpty Dumpty together again. So see what happens here. Bare his soul to his spiritual director with absolute trust, but he should not disclose his personal feelings or problems to anyone else. Excuse me, Dr. Barber was saying that we were kind of like islands of solitude, the Gulag archipelagos, in the words of Solzhenitsyn. We were islands of silence and sometimes of silenced people, whether it be through sexual abuse or so through other kinds of emotional, mental, and physical abuse. It became second nature for us not to mention personal issues at all to anyone, neither to our companions nor to our relatives in our monthly letters home. As the song says, don't cry out loud, just keep it inside. During my first and all consequent crisis of faith in the Legion, it never crossed my mind, nor was it ever suggested to me, that I could consult with someone outside my assigned Legion spiritual director. And let me say right away that, in case I forgot to say this, that this idea of the same person being the rector, the house superior, the community superior, the spiritual director, and the confessor is an absolute aberration. And it may still be going on in the Legion of Christ and in the Regnum Christi movement. Again, the Regnum Christi lay people must go to confession to a legionary priest. And we have cases in the Legion and in the Regnum Christi where the priest does not respect and keep the sacramental secret of confession. And so he may use this information as a superior or to communicate to another superior what the heck is going on inside this poor, unfortunate novice's head. This is gravely serious. It is in contravention of canon law. The Catholic Church, we may want to criticize it, etc., etc., but there is canon law. There's an old canon law, there's a new canon law, and these laws, which are also punishable, if that's the word, um, can be sanctioned by church authorities, cover certain areas. And one of the very important areas is the separation between the internal forum and the external forum. Sounds very funny, you know. Internal forum is my personal life, my conscience, my inner life. This would be something that I could disclose to my confessor, to a priest in confession, knowing full well that he has no right to disclose this to anybody else. The external forum is what the rectory, the seminary superior could learn about this, what they could learn from observation, what my assistants or prefects could notice about my behavior, what I said, what I did openly in public or in the community. But that is separate, and it's very distinctly separate from the internal forum. And one of the great critiques that we have about the Legion of Christ, and I challenge them to counter this, is that they're still doing this kind of thing, which is an absolute no-no. As I say, not only from the psychological, from the human point of view, but also from the Catholic canon law point of view. And the Vatican needs to intervene. It hasn't intervened. It needs to intervene. It has no idea what's going on. Forgive me. Mr. Lennon now is ranting and raving. If on paper, to comply with canon law, recourse to another confessor or spiritual director was permitted, it was not part of any practical option. So it was written on paper, but not in reality. De jure, but non de facto, if I permit the Latinism. The legionaries, the superiors would say, brother, it is not the custom for you to consult with an exterior confessor. And if you did consult with an exterior confessor, then your superior would know about it. And he would become suspicious about you, because why were you asking for from an external confessor? Why did you want to go outside? I never went outside. And I suppose most of my other companions never did either, to have a free, really free confession. It's not the custom. It's not our custom to consult with an outsider, un extraño. They would never understand our charism. Psychological or pastoral counseling were not offered, and I had never even heard of them in the Legion. My resources were clearly defined: spiritual director, who in this case was also the rector, the house superior, and the confessor. And then, of course, Father Maciel. I could write to Father Maciel freely via snail mail, as we call it now. Paragraph, Roses and Thorns. Salamanca was our address, but we rarely ventured outside the cloister to visit the historic city. Isolated from whizzing Vespas and small uncomfortable Seat cars, on summer Sundays we could nevertheless hear the ole swelling from the bullring half a mile away. Oblivious were we to the groups of estudiantina troubadours roaming the streets at night and the crowded tapa bars. Even so, from the top floor of the Novitiate, I sometimes espied strange sights in the surrounding fields. Very poetic here. A tiny figure poised on his toes. I'm looking out, and there's this figure far away in the fields. Man, woman, man, perhaps, pants, yes. A tiny figure poised on its toes in the middle of a grey lentil stubble field, still as a bird. Then in slow motion raising its left arm, while the right held a stick parallel to the ground. The upper body swivels left, twisting at the hips and dragging the nimble feet around in the dust in a graceful backswing. A kid going to throw a stone or unleash a sling? Narrowing my eyes to focus, I make out a novice bullfighter. Maybe this novillero would have his alternativa, his first bullfight, this summer, and become a fully fledged bullfighter in the Plaza de Salamanca. And the next ole we heard as we prayed the rosary, strolling around the grounds on Sunday evening, might be for him. One break we got from our tight and monotonous schedule was the weekly outing. How conspicuous did I feel when we wore those white front-buttoned work coats on our hikes through the Salamanca countryside, looking like a bunch of escaped asylum inmates. That's terrible. Probably looking like medical students at least. And the hikes gave us little respite. They accentuated the freezing cold winter and the torrid summer sun. We missed the soft trees and emerald fields of Ireland, no matter how much our Spanish companions praised the austere beauty of Castile, home of Teresa of Avila and other luminaries of Spanish literature's golden age. Close by the river Tormes, where we often took ourselves in search of shade, they taught us that Fray Luis de Leon had composed his inspired poetry. In the nearby orchard, perhaps he had written his devout literary treatise, The Names of Christ. But for us, for me, Christ was nowhere to be found. My Spanish fellow novices were good-natured, friendly, and hardy, having grown up in the widespread poverty and austerity of Franco's post-Civil War Spain. Hailing some of them from neighboring towns with such Castilian names as Macotera, San Chidrian, and Horcajo de las Torres. Their parents, teachers, civil servants, civil guards, and soldiers, had sent them to the apostolic school in Ontaneda, Santander, at age 11, seeking a good, free education and maybe the service of God for their sons. My Mexican confreres were polite and ingenious, full of regional sayings, and endowed with a vivid imagination to which they gave free rein during our weekly excursions. On the ground floor notice board, each of us was assigned to a terna, a small group of 3 or 4 under the guidance of a teen captain. The captain was a companion sufficiently integrated into the Legion system and trusted by superiors to make sure we behaved during the outings and to lead us in our acts of piety, such as morning meditation on the road, midday examination of conscience, and afternoon rosary. He would also report any bad behavior or conversations that were not full of edifying reflections and anecdotes. Lack of observation of the rules could be called out at the weekly chapter of Falls. Segue into chapter of Falls. This was another traditional monastic practice that our founder had incorporated into his eclectic training system. Very interesting for us to reflect on how Father Maciel created some kind of a smorgasbord, or whatever you would call it, some kind of an Irish stew of religious life practices. So we would take something from the Jesuits, something maybe from the Franciscans, something from the Cistercians. He just put it all together in one big pot according to his uncanny insight into how to run the Legion, how to run his new order, his best order in the world, the order above all orders, the mother of all orders. Forgive me. The superior, seated on a dais at the head of the room, called randomly on a member of the community. The novice would go to the top of the room and kneel down facing the superior, with his novice's back to the community. The kneeling novice listened silently and humbly, without objecting or clarifying, as one of his companions pointed out his dalliances. I have the impression that Brother Paul broke the rule of etiquette yesterday morning when he gobbled down his porridge noisily. Or Brother Anthony made a noise with his chair when he got up from the table. He dragged it, screeched, against the rules of etiquette. I have the impression that Brother Michael was looking around too much during our excursion yesterday, thus breaking the rule number such and such regarding modesty of the eyes. I have the impression that Father Bernard was dozing in the chapel yesterday during even prayer. I believe that Brother John was talking about his past life in a worldly way during recreation time on Monday evening. I heard Brother Christopher indirectly criticize the hairdo of one of the assistant superiors in front of another novice last Wednesday. This petty activity, end of quotes, this petty activity I did not enjoy, and for the most part abstained from calling out my confreres' faults. When I was called up, I bore the nitpicking with Celtic stoicism. Little paragraph. The agony of prayer. Perhaps my problem was compounded by the meditation system indiscriminately imposed by the Legion on all its members. And this is not history, my friend. I've heard this from a young woman in the Regnum Christi not so long ago. She was in there about 10 years ago, but I think she said, my God, isn't this incredible? Imposing one form, one style, one method of mental meditation. We had to learn and practice the discursive affective method. Legion spirituality was heavily indebted or copied from the Jesuit or Ignatian spirituality and to old and traditional version and to the old and traditional version of it. Father Thomas Keating, who now is an expert in the contemplative life, mentions that, describes this method, which is one of dozens of, but this is the one that was imposed on us. And of course, maybe some people were able to adapt to it, and other temperaments, please, different, would not have been able. It would have been a killer, which it was for me. Apparently, this one size fits all meditation method did not fit me, and probably contributed to my inability to pray and to the ensuing distress and mental turmoil. I was never coached by the novice master in overcoming my difficulties, nor was it suggested I could try some other method. This method tended to make me rummage around in my brain, as dry as the remainder biscuit after a long voyage, like the fool touchstone in Shakespeare's As You Like It. Father Arumi unabashedly stated that the Legion was a totalitarian and absolutist organization. Rules were meant to be obeyed without exception, methods followed and system implemented without question. All members had to conform uniformly to the norm. And that's why when you see the legionaries, why are they so uniform? Some people may admire this. It's like an army, absolutely, yes. But it's also, they're like, as a friend of mine said, they're like little tin soldiers, little robots. Forgive me. You may like it. I don't like it. Like it or lump it seemed to be the message from God. Now, over 40 years later, I find some consolation in Father Keating's wise words. Father Keating, thank goodness there are wise um, Catholics and teachers out there. If one attempts to persevere in discursive meditation after the Holy Spirit has called one beyond it, as the Spirit ordinarily does, one is bound to wind up in a state of utter frustration. It is normal for the mind to move through many reflections on the same theme to a single comprehensible view of the whole, than to rest with a single gaze upon the truth. As devout people move spontaneously into this development of their prayer, they were up against this negative attitude towards contemplation. They hesitated to go beyond discursive meditation to affective prayer. Me, Mr. Affectionate, because of the warnings they had been given about the dangers of contemplation. In the end, they either gave up mental prayer altogether as something for which they were evidently unsuited, or through the mercy of God, found some way of persevering in spite of what seemed like insurmountable obstacles. Wow, what a revelation! Hope this helps other people. Uh, Heading Automatic Compassion Pilot. How are we doing? Getting on there. The novice master appointed me assistant enfermero, male nurse to the community of novices and juniors, humanities students who had finished novitiate. He did not explain why. I would devote myself tirelessly and unselfishly to that mission all through my formative years in Salamanca and Rome. So I'm something, what do they call this? The wounded healer? During novitiate, this job kept me busy, occasionally diverting the obsessive thoughts that plagued me. What if all this is not true? If there is no God, no Jesus, no Eucharist? My spiritual director's advice, I would later comprehend, was along the lines of spiritual sublimation, another system, another tactic that is used in the Legion. Spiritual sublimation, and I'm very attuned to this. This is one of my personal intuitions. In other words, when you have a problem, whatever it is, you immediately spiritualize this. And you take it to a higher plane without passing through the human process of dealing with the pain, dealing with the obstacles, or simply solving the problem. This is called sublimation. I think it's a Freudian term. I call it spiritual sublimation, or a kind of denial. Offer it up to the Sacred Heart. And then another famous was, go pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Now, can you imagine this? Paul Lennon has a terrible crisis of faith. He can't believe in anything. And he goes to his superior, Father, I'm totally distressed. I don't know what to do. Preparing for the priesthood and I don't believe in Jesus. Brother, the best thing you can do is go to the chapel, kneel before the Blessed Sacrament, and ask Jesus to help you. Jesus, I can't believe in Jesus. But I couldn't say anything. I couldn't go against my superior's words because that would be criticizing the superior. That would be going against the second vow, the private vow that I had taken after my religious vows. Forget yourself and your rationalism, brother. Be simple. Stop being you're complicated. Be simple. La sencillez. So you take the practical exam on simplicity this Sunday when you're doing your practical exam after the talk. Sencillez. You're too complicated. You're always asking questions. Deny yourself. Abnegation. Self-denial. Be more generous with Christ. Thank goodness I had some practical stuff to do to take me away from this craziness. On a practical level, I was occupied taking care of the medical needs of my fellow novices. Besides the common cold, some took to bed in need of some compassion, or someone to talk to, or to take a break from the strain of the non-stop schedule. I didn't realize it at the time, but yeah, there were brothers who somatized, and they went to bed and they had a cold and they needed someone to show a little bit of compassion to them. And there was nothing bad in this. There was nothing unhealthy in this. There was nothing morally improper in this. It was just people who need someone to talk to without being monitored, without being spied on. Our day was minutely regulated from 5:20 a.m. until 9 o'clock at night, interspersed with 10-minute free times to attend to one's personal hygiene and needs. Maybe brush your shoes or something like that, or wash your socks. Between dinner in silence and last prayers, we had 20 minutes of quiete, quiet time, or relaxation, which was spent walking to and fro in groups of three or four. Las ternas. Numbers mandated, talking of pious subjects and exchanging thoughts about the Legion or the holiness of Father Maciel. I remember some of the brothers got hepatitis and as such were very irritable with me as a nurse. I was mortified. When you get hepatitis, you're really very, very irritable. They would snap at me. Oh my goodness, I had to be really good there. But I offered all this suffering for my vocation and for the attentions of Nuestro Padre Maciel and for our Holy Father the Pope. By the way, uh, in my previous statements, I may have been talking about Pope John Paul the 23rd. Of course, he didn't exist. I was talking about Pope John the 23rd, who was the Pope at my time of being recruited and who was featured in the fancy and shiny brochure that Father Quandro used for his recruiting. One of my companions even came down with meningitis, which, despite my ignorance and the lack of reaction from superiors, was still pretty scary. I could see that my companion was suffering intensely. Normally, we would handle all illnesses ourselves without outside help, those outsiders. Uh, Father Penilla, a seminarian, and I would do the caring, the health, medical attention. We weren't qualified. In case of dire need, we had a doctor from Salamanca come visit. He'd probably a volunteer, doing something for the padres free of charge. I was on automatic compassion pilot. It helped because my prayer life was pure agony. There were no juices flowing in my soul during my hour-long morning meditation, my adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, and my evening prayer. Spiritual reading consisted of Father Colina's arid explanation of rules, Father Rodriguez's ancient anecdotes, and Nuestro Padre's letters. Midday and nighttime conscious examination kept the spring coiled tightly. I'm going to say, almost closing here now. Another little paragraph talks about corporal mortification and how a few months into my novitiate, I got